everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Katie Gardner. I'm part of the Environmental Law Project over some of the events and things going on. So this is the first kind of event that Environmental Law Project is having for the year. This would be a perfect time. And for kind of an introduction, we figured what a better topic than to do some challenges, environmental challenges in Pennsylvania, make it local, kind of starting now and then going on in the future. So just a little bit about Environmental Law Project, for those of you all who don't know, haven't gotten a chance to become involved with us yet. We are pro bono and kind of a club at Penn, so kind of hold a unique position in both sides. And if you were here last year, year before, we didn't do quite as many events, and we're trying to ramp that up a little bit, have more topics where we, panels and events where we can share some knowledge about the subject, because it's something I guess a lot of people in Penn, we don't really look as much about kind of outside the corporate world. And other things, if you've done pro bono work with us before, you can do, maybe had some contact with Alice or some of the other people in the panel with some of the projects we've done. So that's the gist. Dominic, if you have anything to add to that, I mean, you're welcome to in the middle of a bite, of course, but to put you on the spot here, yeah.
Hi everyone, Dominic Collins, the Vice Chair of DLP. If you are interested in environmental law or more broadly in topics of regulation or administrative law, we're one of the best pro bono projects to attend, because every semester we have a dedicated regulatory project as well. That's also a sub-endorsement. I encourage you to take administrative law in your second semester or one else. But yeah, if you're interested in finding out about environmental law internships, environmental justice issues in Pennsylvania and beyond, please sign up for our emails and feel free to be in touch. Thank you.
Definitely get in contact with either of us if you have any questions. So that'll enough about us. Let's get to our panelists. Again, I said, as I mentioned before, our topic is environmental challenges this year and going forward. So we figured we'd get a few groups in the area to come talk about this and give us kind of their thoughts, what they've been working on, and how they see it changing potentially or not going forward. So starting off, we have Alice. She's with PennFuture, one of the Philadelphia-based attorneys. Prior to that, she worked in private environmental law. Served as director of New York City Environmental Law Leadership Institute, nonprofit designed to inform, equip, and inspire new environmental attorneys, and continues involvement with that. She also has worked with NRDC and Eastern Environmental Law Center, and with the Environmental Defense Fund, Hudson Riverkeeper, and New York Office of Attorney Generals. Next we have Alex. He's a senior litigation attorney at Clean Air Council, graduated from Columbia Law, and went to work at Pebble Hamilton as commercial litigation associate for 7 years. And then in 2015, he began work with Clean Air Council, the largest and oldest Philadelphia-based environmental advocacy nonprofit. He works mostly on legal challenges with natural gas infrastructure and participates in regulatory process, and also is involved with the council's litigation across the board. Next we have Chad. He is the Pennsylvania organizer for the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and joined there in 2010 after working with Envision Spokane on a Bill of Rights protecting neighborhoods, workers, and the environment. He moved on to assist New England and communities in Maine and New Hampshire protecting the environment, and now lives and organizes in Pennsylvania, assisting communities in rights-based organizing on issues from environmental protection to prisoners' rights. And then finally we have Karen. She's also an attorney working with also with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund to represent communities across Pennsylvania fighting to protect their environment. And she also works with ALDIA, People's Justice Center, to represent asylum seekers in detention, including families detained at Berks and separated at the border. She also runs a solo law practice in Old City and attended school at Temple when previous to that she was a journalist. So thank you all so much for coming here. And I guess I'm going to start it off with, so start up with Alice and then move, I guess, as you all want to. Just give an overview of the groups, your focuses, and kind of explaining what you do and how you typically do it.
Can you all hear me, or do I need to use the mic? Okay, I'm just going to talk then. So I work for PennFuture. It's a Pennsylvania-based environmental advocacy group. We have offices across the state, so Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and Mount Pocono up in the Northeast. We have attorneys in each of our office, and I think that's sort of different than a lot of the other environmental groups in Pennsylvania. And so we litigate and engage in sort of regulatory practice across the state. And each of the attorneys is sort of slightly regionalized, although we all collaborate. So I'm the Southeast attorney. Most of my issues are in the Southeast. Our Pittsburgh attorney, most of his issues are in the West. That tends to work out because a lot of the issues across the state are, there's a lot of natural gas extraction in the West, and so he focuses a lot on natural gas extraction where there isn't in the Delaware River Basin, and so that tends to not be a large focus of my practice. In addition to attorneys in each of our offices, we have a lobbyist or a legislative liaison based in Harrisburg who's often on the Hill and has relationships with a lot of the state representatives and can sort of spend some of his time lobbying on issues that we think are important or that are impacting Pennsylvania's environment. We do some federal work, although most of our work is based in Pennsylvania. And when we do get engaged in federal work, it's because that issue has significant impacts in Pennsylvania. So other than that, we have outreach staff, which we try to use to sort of elevate our legal and policy initiatives. So they're frequently meeting with smaller watershed groups on how they can get involved in some of our issues, or activating them to talk to, come to lobby days. And we have been around this is our 20th year, so we've been around for a little while. And pass it to Alex.
Thank you. So the acoustics in here are great. I will also not use the microphone. Oh, maybe it is. Is this even louder? Yeah, it is. Okay. Oh, well. So I'm Alex. I work at Clean Air Council as a senior litigation attorney. Clean Air Council is an environmental nonprofit that does a lot more than clean air, even though that's baked into our name. We also deal with water issues, waste issues. We work across the state, but we're based in Philly, and a lot of what we do is in Philly. We have events like Green Fest, which is the area's largest environmental festival, and we have Run for Clean Air, etc. A lot like PennFuture, we have different aspects to the organization. So I'm one of the lawyers. We have 5 practicing lawyers. We also have an advocacy/outreach group that does a lot of organizing across the state. We have people working in different places across the state with communities who are trying to defend their communities and their health against, people trying to destroy their land and their property. And we also do a little lobbying and a lot of other stuff. And I find that model of having a litigation team, an organizing team, a policy team is very useful and necessary for everybody to work together. So we the lawyers work constantly with people on the ground, with people in the community, as a resource, sort of a hub for information, and we see ourselves as part of a larger movement. I would say I see myself as more than a lawyer, as part of the environmental movement, and my role is to use my skills in furtherance of those goals. I've been with Clean Air Council for about 3.5 years now. Before that, I was in private practice at a firm in town. It's very different, but a lot of it's also the same. Like, litigation is litigation. If you do one type of litigation, I found the transition wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. The odds, though, are now stacked entirely against me, whereas before it was more like an even playing field, So that's very different. And we have a lot fewer resources. So a lot of what I do needs experts, hired experts, which, preview for the future are very expensive, like tens of thousands of dollars expensive. And we sometimes can't use experts in a case, and we sometimes can't do things that in private practice we would want to do. A lot of what I do is, as Katie said, related to natural gas infrastructure. So that means pipelines, sometimes power plants, compressor stations. A compressor station is basically like it keeps the stuff in the pipeline moving. It's the energy behind the stuff in the pipeline. And so a lot of that involves appeals of permits, involvement in the regulatory process. I wish I had taken administrative law in law school. I didn't. But writing comments during comment periods, talking with people in the agencies, Pennsylvania DEP, and others. And it's a lot of fun. I think it's really, really fun. But it's also really hard. And I think probably everybody here will agree with that. And it's also, it's a very, I won't go off on this for too long, but it's very fulfilling, especially because some of these people we're fighting against are essentially like criminal enterprises. They make their business happen by skirting the law at every step and using brute force rather than, going through the steps that you and me have to go through when we do things in this world of laws that we live in. So it's interesting, but I'll stop there and pass it along.
Thank you. Chad Nicholson with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. We've been in Pennsylvania a little over 20 years at this point. When we opened in the mid-90s, it was to provide free legal services to, at that point, mostly rural communities across Pennsylvania that were facing environmental threats. And so we would get phone calls on a variety of issues. Back then, it was things like factory farms, spreading of municipal sewage sludge on farmland, longwall coal mining, toxic waste incinerators, things like that. These days, we still get calls on all of those issues and many more, including natural gas infrastructure, pipelines, compressor stations, fracking, injection wells, things like that. And new stuff that seems to come up every day that I've never heard of. So what our work used to be was about working with these communities to appeal the permits that had been issued for these projects. So none of these things can take place, factory farms, fracking, pipelines, unless the company that wants to put them into the community has a permit from a relevant regulatory agency, whether it's the DEP or the EPA or FERC or whoever. Our work with the communities early on was to try to appeal those permits, basically to try to convince the regulatory agencies that they issued the permit in error, that it was a bad idea for the community because it was going to have all these harms. Our organization found that ultimately to be unsatisfying because we found we were rarely able to actually stop the projects. At best, we were left trying to regulate the harms that went along with them. And our work at that point shifted into what we now do, which we basically call civil rights for the environment in many ways, which is we still get the same calls from the communities, but we don't work with them to appeal permits anymore. We work with them to draft and enact local laws called community bills of rights that actually set out rights for the community, rights to a healthy environment, rights to self-govern, rights for nature, things like that, and then prohibit and ban activities that would violate the rights of the community. Sometimes can be controversial strategy because that often invites a lawsuit from the corporation that possesses a permit. They can sue the community to try to remove their law that's banning the activity, at which point we then provide pro bono legal services to represent the community in court. We expected the challenges from the corporate side. More recently, what we didn't expect is that we're also getting lawsuits from state agencies. So we have represented 2 communities now that have been fighting injection wells that have been sued by the State Department of Environmental Protection. So our Department of Environmental Protection is suing communities that are trying to protect their environment. We can get into that more later. We also have represented communities that have been sued by our own Attorney General. The Attorney General is authorized to sue communities that try to stop factory farms or that try to stop the dumping of sewage sludge within their communities. So we actually have a community right now that's received a threat letter from our Attorney General trying to overturn their ordinance that bans factory farms. So we can get into more of that later, but I'll just say that our experience early on and our recent experience as well has taken our perspective that the problem is less about environmental issues and it's more constitutional issues. So we also see links between environmental problems that are now being linked up with urban social justice issues. So we're getting calls on election problems, campaign finance, labor issues, prisons, police accountability. And from our perspective, what all of these things have in common is that the people that are being most affected by these issues often don't have the legal tools they need to adequately protect themselves. So they're left in a position of defense trying to mitigate harms rather than saying, we don't want the harm at all, and we that live here should have the authority to say no to these things and not be left trying to regulate it. So in addition to the local work, we're now moving to the state level because we do believe that it is constitutional. We have been meeting with legislators over the past year attempting to introduce constitutional amendments that would be about giving communities more control and more authority over all of these issues. So, do you want to add anything to that?
I would just add, we also work, well, CELDF is sort of a loose linkage, a decentralized, even though it's based in Pennsylvania, I think there's about 12 lawyers in various states throughout the country, and then also working internationally, particularly on rights of nature issues. So CELDF helped Ecuador, I think that was the first, well, the first community that put rights of nature in its law was Tamaqua Borough in
Schuylkill County,
Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. And that sort of led to somehow Ecuador hearing about that and wanting to, reaching out to CELDF to try and put it in its constitution, which we helped them do, not me personally. I've only been working with CELDF since December, so much less time than Chad. But that really has caught fire, bad analogy, around the world. And we're continuing to work with various governments and communities on specifically rights of nature. And even in Pittsburgh has passed a community bill of rights, basically, and it does include rights of nature, right? So, throwing that there.
So moving to, I guess, the kind of the main meat of this, what do you all see, what have been the main challenges in the past few years, and what have you focused on mostly? I mean, we touched on this, but any more add on that?
Well, so I have a number of things here, and I think we've all sort of maybe started to touch on them. I think one challenge in Pennsylvania environmental law is sort of the political climate and how that influences how you can litigate and sort of the structure that's been set up for enforcing and implementing environmental laws. You know, the House and the Senate are pretty conservative right now, and honestly have been for a while. And I'm sort of relatively new to Pennsylvania practice as well, and it's sort of shocking how things like DEP is set up to have an environmental hearing board. So when you appeal challenges, it goes to an environmental hearing board within DEP, which is a quasi-court, but sort of an administrative thing. And that's de novo review, which means that you have to get experts. You have to do all this work that might have taken DEP 15 years to implement a permit, or like review and accept a permit. And now you have 30 days to find an expert, review the permit, figure out what's wrong with it, and start your discovery process, you know. And I think that sets up this this inequity in sort of the public environmental advocacy realm. You're already set up sort of to struggle against DEP. And I think that plays out in other ways, like DEP doesn't establish its own regulations. They have to send that to this quasi-legislative board, the Environmental Quality Board, that decides whether or not DEP, the agency that holds this information, the expert agency on environmental issues, regulation is appropriate. And that to have that sort of legislative oversight of this agency that's supposed to be you know, the expert is a little crazy. And I think it also leads into funding, which I think means that DEP tends to not be aggressive on its permits and sort of acquiesce to some of the larger, powerful corporations that can, you know, put in permits for things and make the permits so large and unwieldy that that they skirt issues that should be enforced. And so So that's, I think that's, larger than recently, but definitely playing out recently. And I think the underfundedness also goes to enforcement, the age, and I think this is happening. Maybe this is a more sort of current thing that DEP isn't enforcing the way that we would like to see them at the federal level. EPA isn't the backstop that we want it to be anymore. And so we're left sort of with no one in that space. And I think it's something from PennFuture's perspective that we haven't traditionally been enforcers, even though the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act gives the public the ability to bring citizen suits. We haven't done that in the you're violating your DMRs, you're violating your permit context previously, and I think we're sort of struggling with, is that a space that we should get into more when EPA and DEP aren't doing what we think they need to be doing in that space? So those are some of my points. I don't know if you guys
I might jump
follow
in
up on some
if
of
that's
it.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree. Alice is right in everything she's saying. I mean, the problem starts at the political level, and really at the people level and the political level. So we don't have a state that's particularly interested in protecting the environment. A lot of people in DEP want to protect the environment. That's why most of them are there. They're well-meaning people, but they don't have the money to do their job, and they are working within a culture that is the people they interact with most are the people in industry. That's their day-to-day, is dealing with those people. And when you do that, you get this whole culture and mindset of everything's really okay, it's just a matter of working out the details. And that's sort of the attitude, is let's not deny any permits, we'll just work with them and compromise and figure out how to make things work, which is not what the law says. And it's also not, what the people need. The people, and I know I'm focusing on permits, and it's a lot broader than permits, but if the law says this application for a permit is not adequate, then sure, maybe work with them to get it to adequate, but if they're not going to get it to adequate, then you deny it. But that's not what happens. They issue it and then try to deal with the consequences later. And it's because in a lot of ways, if people within DEP, if they feel like they step out of their lane, if they try to go and actually enforce the law like it's written, there will be political blowback. And the agency's funding will get cut more, people will be fired. There's a culture of fear, and also fear of lawsuits from industry. So it's very much not how an agency should be working. An agency should be empowered to fulfill its role, to protect the environment, which is its mission. But it doesn't feel like an agency that's empowered to do that. And we have to start with people organizing around their communities, protecting their communities, and also having political movement building. Because otherwise our politicians are not going to be responsive to people's needs to protect their communities, protect their land, protect their health. I don't know if you guys want to add stuff to that.
Yeah, I think, backing out a bit from the role of DEP as well, it's easy to be down on environmental protections in the DEP in Pennsylvania, and there's some higher profile wins of other regulatory agencies in other states, like the DEC in New York has denied permits and things like that. And so, but our experience in working with, probably 20 other states at this point in the country is that some may be a bit more responsive than others, but that ultimately the environmental regulatory agencies are relatively powerless to say no or to actually mitigate the harms from some of the larger scale industrial activities. And that backs up, from our perspective, to a couple of other legal doctrines, including preemption. So the state or federal governments pass laws that preempt municipalities or communities from having a say on these issues. So the state has passed the Oil and Gas Act. And in the Oil and Gas Act, they've essentially said, we're going to set uniform regulations for most communities in the state on various issues, and the communities can't interfere with those regulations. And then the DEP carries out those regulations. So that's the authority that the DEP is using to sue Grant Township, fighting the injection well, is that the DEP is saying we can't have local communities interfering with state oil and gas law because this is about uniform policy across the state. So you have Harrisburg, through laws like the Oil and Gas Act, setting uniform policy that communities can't actually go beyond to enact more stringent or more protective, methods for health and safety. So the state and federal governments actually remove authority from the people most affected to be involved in that decision-making process. In addition to that, corporations, the companies that want to engage in these activities, they possess these permits, which give to them a property right when they have that permit. And if the community wants to interfere with the company's ability to engage in that activity, they are then interfering with that company's permit and their property rights in that community. So we're getting a little into the weeds here, but I'll just say what that means is that the permit then authorizes these corporations to sue these communities to get their local laws out of the way, or to actually sue them for damages if they try to interfere with the company's activity. So we have constitutional rights conferred onto corporations. Those are mostly judicially conferred. We also have state or federal preemptive laws that have removed authority from communities. And all of that has then left the DEP, or the EPA in many cases too, basically in an impotent role where they don't really have much authority to go further to try to protect the environment, even if the good people inside those agencies want to. They're essentially hamstrung. Their hands have been tied for them. And I mean, just one last piece on this. Who in here has been to an environmental hearing before a regulatory agency? Anybody? One or two people? Okay.
Yeah, you should go. It's very educational. Very educational.
That's one way to put it. I've been at these things, they go to 1 or 2 in the morning sometimes, and they can be cathartic because everybody gets to yell and scream at the regulators or at the company's reps that are there. But what we often do now with communities we work with is when they go, they can bring up all the information they want, but we ask them to ask the regulators a very specific question, which is anything that we say at these actually going to have an effect on whether or not the permit is issued? And usually you get the platitudes is, well, we're happy you're here, we like to have citizen engagement, we want everybody's voices to be heard, this and that. But if you push them on that question, and I've heard this dozens of times, the answer is always no, because their answer is, if the permit application is administratively complete, if everything is there, the agency doesn't actually have discretion or authority to deny it. They have to issue it because they're administrative and they're carrying out state law. So it's been an education for us. I think there are still, things that are worthwhile doing within that sphere, but overall, I think from our perspective, I mentioned it's constitutional, and some of the bigger picture stuff, which is that state passes laws that removes authority from the people being most affected, and corporations have more rights and more privileges than the majority of people living in communities. So those are some of the bigger issues from our perspective.
And just to add to that, in Pennsylvania specifically, another law that we had mentioned earlier, it's called ACRE. It's basically a state law that that authorizes the Pennsylvania Attorney General to sue communities that pass local ordinances regulating farming in any way.
Law?
I don't think
Sounds like.
but it's another preemption, state preemption law that we are currently fighting against. And we believe there's good authority for it to be unconstitutional, but it's just another fun part of the landscape in Pennsylvania.
I think one thing that's sort of interesting about Pennsylvania is that it does have the Environmental Rights Amendment, and how I think that's like it's been in the Constitution for many, many years, but hasn't had much power and authority until very recently. And I think the legal community is really grappling with how to develop that case law and that sort of tool in a way that's effective for us. And I'm sure you guys are working on that and might have something to say about it.
Alice, if you don't mind, do you mind to explain that for people who aren't familiar with Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so the Environmental Rights Amendment of Pennsylvania is in Article 1, Section 27 of our Constitution, and is this very broad and lofty language about the right to clean air, Pennsylvanians' right to clean air and clean water. And I think it really just wasn't in case law until the early, 2014 or so was sort of the first time it came up in the fracking context. And since then, there have been a couple sort of choice Pennsylvania Supreme Court decisions on it that seem to be breathing life into what this means and whether it's an affirmative action, like whether there's an affirmative duty to protect this clean air and clean water, or whether this administrative agency's sort of suite of laws sufficiently does that. And I think that's something we're all sort of trying to develop in a very thoughtful way, and choosing our cases and our issues strategically to make sure that law develops.
Alice, do you have any thoughts on whether, in fact, the current state of the law is in conformity with the Environmental Rights
Absolutely
Amendment?
not. Although DEP would fight me to the nail on that. Yeah, I mean, you know, like, we see the laws are being implemented. I mean, in DEP's mind, they are implementing the laws according to what they're supposed to doing. Their obligations, they're fulfilling their obligations. And yet we see our environment degrading. And so how can that ensure Pennsylvanians' constitutional right to clean air and clean water when we see our environmental resources going down the drain while DEP says that they're in compliance with their laws and that constitutional amendment through application of their laws? So, Alex, you have thoughts?
Yeah, I agree, not surprisingly. Yeah, and to go back to a little bit of what we were talking about earlier too, I think a lot of environmental law, you know, if you're looking at a strategy side of things, so I think a lot of us here at the table don't just do lawyering. Alice and I were talking about this earlier. I mean, we're part of organizations and we work to fulfill the organization's mission. And so, like, part of what we do is thinking about strategy, and part of that is figuring out, you know, what do we want to get and what are the ways we have to get there. And it comes down to, you know, like, what is the role of the lawyers in part. And, you know, usually when things get to the lawyers, it's late in the game in a lot of ways, like, especially litigators. Like, you don't want issues to get to that point where you have to litigate them. You want them to be resolved the right way the first time, and then there's no lawsuit. But so we're in difficult positions because it's late in the game, you know? And an example for the Environmental Rights Amendment, the case that Alice was referring to, sometimes called the Robinson Township decision, and Robinson Township case was in response, it was a lawsuit in response to Act 13 of 2013 maybe, or 2012 maybe, which was very similar to it was really tied into what CELDF is doing, because it was a law that said that all municipalities, among other things, all municipalities have to allow fracking in every zone in their zoning scheme. Residential zone, commercial zone, no matter the municipality, no matter whether it made sense in that context at all. And it didn't in a lot of times, in a lot of cases, and in all cases maybe too, but that was late, you know, that was late in the game, and it worked in that case. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned parts of Act 13, including those crucial parts of Act 13. But how did it get passed in the first place? You know, like, we shouldn't have a Pennsylvania where that kind of thing gets passed. And the provisions in it were so blatantly unconstitutional in several ways.
Yeah, on the ERA, I think just talking about DEP fighting tooth and nail on it, I mean, the case that Chad mentioned where the DEP is suing a township for banning frac waste injection, we had counterclaims that actually survived a motion to dismiss based on the ERA. So that was encouraging for us. I mean, obviously that's not the fundamental sort of basis for most of CELDF's work. We tend to focus on just the inherent right to local self-government, but it is definitely a tool that we are glad to be able to use, and we're, you know, it's exciting to see, like, the possibilities and how different groups are using it to defend the environment in Pennsylvania.
It's definitely an emerging area of case law, right? So.
And on that note, do we want to turn to some of the things we see going forward? How do you anticipate this changing, if it changes at all? I mean, are there any hints, and even like the political climate, that's been a huge deal that you all have been talking about. And how do you all anticipate tackling some of these? Are you going to change any of your methods or keep going with how it has been working or not? But yeah. Whoever wants to jump in.
Anyone else?
I'll start. I think that, I mean, in terms of like the urgency, I think it's definitely building. You know, that people are seeing that if we don't act and maybe take more drastic steps than we have been, that things are rapidly in decline. And I mean, the news that just came out about the federal government basically saying, it's sort of like climate nihilism, like saying, well, climate's gonna, it's gonna be 7 degrees hotter by, I don't know, 2100 or something, so like, screw it, let's just like make as much money as we can and like roll back all the environmental regulations. I mean, it's insane. And that's our, bless you, that's our like federal regulation protectors, it's terrifying. So yeah, I mean, that does open up some opportunities in terms of getting people's attention at least, and maybe making them realize that like the government is probably not going to save you. But I mean, in terms of our work, like our organization, I think that part of our vision for the future is definitely going to be reaching out intersectionally in terms of other social justice issues, and because there is a lot of connection, I mean, between like all these issues, honestly, and the environment. So that's just speaking for CELDF.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to always be the dour one in these conversations, but our experience over the years doesn't give us a lot of hope that the courts or the legislature are going to be our saviors. And so, we have organizers mostly, in this organization, and we have lawyers that work with us. But for us, it's more of an organizing and an educational strategy to help people understand how the system currently works, so that when we devise strategies, whether they're legal or whether they're organizing grassroots strategies, that we at least know what we're up against. And just we've kind of been teasing out this Grant Township example, but I think it gives the clearest example of how we see the system operating, and that informs the work that we're doing. I'm just going to do it in probably 1 minute here. But so Grant Township is a rural municipality, 700 people, Indiana County, west central Pennsylvania. $32,000 annual tax base that goes to the government. I mean, it's extremely, extremely small, rural, and poor. Fighting a frac waste injection well. Been permitted, I don't know if folks are familiar with them, but it's where they dump the waste that's produced by fracking operations. They've caused earthquakes in other states. The waste is radioactive. It can contaminate water. I mean, there's all this list of harms. The company that wants to dump it in there is Pennsylvania General Energy, which is one of the top 10 permit violators in Pennsylvania. They violate their DEP permits routinely. So the community is obviously concerned. Yet PGE received permits from the EPA, federal level, and the DEP at the state level to put this thing in. So their only option at that point was to try to work locally to enact a law that would ban it, knowing that that would elicit a lawsuit. They got sued in federal court by the company. The judge has agreed with the company that the community didn't have the authority to enact that law. They were preempted by state oil and gas act. And so in addition to that, the company has claimed that their constitutional rights were violated. One of which being the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law passed after the Civil War, right, to apply the law equally to all classes of people, blacks as well as whites. PGE claimed that by the community banning the injection well, they were discriminating against PGE's business interests. So they allow other businesses within the community, but they don't allow this frac injection well, so that's discrimination under the 14th Amendment.
Well, and also the ordinance didn't say that, it only banned corporations from injecting frac waste, not individuals, so that was discrimination, because obviously a lot of individual people are going around injecting frac waste.
Yeah.
I did that just this last weekend.
Yeah.
I don't know about you guys.
It's a hobby. The judge agreed that their rights were violated and that the community didn't have the authority to pass this law. The judge is now waiting to rule on attorney's fees, of whether or not Grant Township owes at least $100,000 up to $700,000 in attorney's fees. In addition, in that case, our attorneys, 2 of our attorneys have been sanctioned individually by the judge for $52,000. The judge claimed that we were making improper and frivolous arguments for trying to protect the community from frac waste. So that's in the federal case. In the state case, again, we have the DEP suing the community now in state court, claiming that communities can't be interfering with state oil and gas policy and uniformity. So this is the clearest picture of the system that we have been able to see, which is you have the company, the federal judge, and the DEP all acting basically in lockstep to try to oppress this community from trying to protect its environment, and punishing the attorneys that are also involved in the case from even having the audacity to represent a community that wants to stand up to one of these companies. So that's what gives at least me the skepticism that we're going to get any meaningful remedies, at least at the scale that we need to address the scope of the problems that our communities are facing anytime soon. I think we will continue to use the Robinson decision and the ERA, the Article 1, Section 27 arguments, and we need to. But for us, we think a much larger movement, not just for environmental justice, but social justice as well, at the constitutional level is what's got to be built at some point. And so we want to use these cases and the environmental issues to help illuminate what's going on and how deep the structural problems go. But I think overall it's going to probably come from the people that are going to create the changes we need rather than the courts.
Yeah, I agree with all that. A lot of camaraderie here. I want to tell you a few little things before I talk about the future. Frack waste, fun little thing if you all don't know. The historical practice in Pennsylvania has just been to spray it on roads and let it wash off into the soil and streams. I am not kidding. Radioactive, toxic fracking waste, they just sprayed on roads. They called it brine. Yeah. Interesting.
de-icing.
For de-icing. Yeah. There's been a study, actually, it doesn't work. But, you know, that doesn't matter. And another thing, attorney's fees. They're going after CELDA for attorney's fees. Sunoco is going after Clean Air Council and Delaware Riverkeeper Network and Mountain Watershed Association for attorney's fees, about $300,000 in attorney's fees. And the basis for that, law students, is that we were negotiating, and the negotiation, some of the things we were suggesting in negotiation were not things we could have gotten if the case had gone to trial, which is a fine thing to do, but that's their basis for bad faith and why they deserve attorney's fees from us. So the arguments that you hear from them when you're in the environmental field, them being the other side, are crazier than average. Again, having worked in private practice for 7 years, this is crazier than that. So, but power building, I agree. I mean, that is the way forward. That's the only way forward, is to build a movement and to strengthen the movement and to build it at the local level, because that's right, the government is not going to protect us. Another little anecdote. I was part of a deposition of somebody at DEP, remain nameless, people at DEP, but it was a case involving a fracking well in western PA. And the process there, you don't need to go through a normal permitting process to put in a well. Basically, you write up some notes in some DEP forms about the well you're going to put in. They look over it and they literally make sure the right boxes are checked, and then it's approved. It doesn't matter if it's right next to a nursing home or an elementary school. It doesn't matter anything what's around it, as long as it's 500 feet from a home, unless that 500 feet has been waived. And 500 feet, if you look at the medical studies, is not at all enough to be a safe distance. Medical studies look at like a mile, 2 miles, that sort of thing. So we were deposing these DEP people, and the one looked at it for, I don't remember exactly, maybe a half hour, an hour, gone through the checklist, and the supervisor looked at that for 3 minutes. And that was the process for this multi-million-dollar oil and gas facility to get approved. And it's crazy. And that's because we have, some of our laws suck, and we need to get better laws. And a lot of our laws are actually pretty good, but they're interpreted in crazy ways by the agencies and by industry, and they're not enforced. Going back to sort of more out of the abstract level and more towards the nitty-gritty, I mean, I feel like a lot of people in the environmental movement in Pennsylvania have been dealing with fracking in particular for the last decade, because that's when it's sort of exploded in Pennsylvania. That's not going to be the primary challenge forever in Pennsylvania, because these fracking wells, despite what industry likes to, promote, they're not going to be producing at the same level for 50, 100 years. That's not how they work. Compared to conventional oil and gas wells, they actually spike and then drop much faster. So this gas boom that we're in is an exaggerated version of the boom and bust cycle that ruins economies locally and across states. It went up fast, it's going to go down faster. But we're going to be left dealing with the aftermath of that for literally centuries. What are the next challenges going to be in Pennsylvania? Well, dealing with the aftermath. But also, people are going to be looking for the next big thing to sell our resources and, get them out of Pennsylvania, sell them somewhere else. Already in Western Pennsylvania, the fracking boom has been, there's a push to have it be transformed into a petrochemical alley, so to speak, along the Ohio River Valley. There's already been one plastics plant that's under construction outside of Pittsburgh. They want to put several more plastics plants in. There's always sort of this reactive thing that we have to deal with, but while we're dealing with the reactivity, we need to really be pushing, I hate the corporate-y word, but proactively to get better laws on the books and to get a better culture of enforcement and to get a more powerful movement, and that involves everyone in this room. That involves voting, that involves being involved at your local level politically and as an activist. And since you're going to be lawyers, probably most of you, it involves, if you're up for it, doing what you can for the movement, and to protect people. And what I do is not all, it doesn't feel like it's all about the environment, it feels like it's a lot about people being, rolled over, people like industry coming in and taking people's power away from them, taking people's land from them through eminent domain or other methods, buying off their officials, their local officials, so that they no longer have a voice, breaking their laws with impunity, breaking municipal laws with impunity, and municipalities are scared to enforce too. I see that all the time. So it's really about empowering people as opposed to empowering the industries that come in and try to exploit people.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, and I think particularly the sort of breaking of silos. I think that the environmental movement tends to like its lane of environmental issues, and understanding that they do cross over into all of these different realms, including like property rights, but also all the environmental justice and urban issues that arise. And I think sometimes it's difficult to remember to do that, but I think that's the way that we ultimately sort of gain back some of that power. Sort of concretely, PennFuture has established a relationship with Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, which is a C4 organization, in order to ramp up lobbying. So this is all weird, nonprofit and tax law issues, but nonprofits are only allowed to lobby up to a certain amount, and through our relationship with Conservation Voters Pennsylvania, we can lobby more. And the goal and intent and purpose behind that is to get better people into office and make sure that they're paying attention to environmental issues and elevating those environmental issues for our elected officials. I think our elected officials frequently, there are other, and even at the municipal level, there are just other concerns, right? They're worried about the pothole in the street, and they're worried about paying for their schools and paying for police force and all this other stuff that environmental issues tend to sink to the bottom. And I think that's where that breaking down some of those silos and making people understand that those potholes in your road might be coming from the fact that you're spreading brine from frack waste on them, and maybe you should stop doing that, and you can do these other things that sort of all end up having a better environmental outcome and addressing some of the other problems that folks are facing. And then at the other side of things that we sort of touched on, but I think the current political and from state and federal level, the sense that I've been getting is that there's the desire in the nonprofit public interest community to be more aggressive and to fill this void that's happening. And so I think we hear it from our funders and from our leadership within our organization all the time of wanting to be more aggressive, wanting to push these issues a little bit further because people know that they don't have a backstop of DEP or EPA, and so wanting to sort of not risky, or you don't want to bring things that are like totally frivolous, but sort of pushing that line of like, you know what, we think we have a claim here. We think this is an issue. We think these people deserve protections, and we're gonna pursue that aggressively as advocates for them. So that's all I have.
Wonderful. So kind of wrap this up, is there anything you will recommend to people in this room, what they can do during school and kind of afterwards, how to get involved, even if you end up going working for a big law firm? I mean, is there, what can we do to help, I guess?
And will there be time for questions?
Yes, and I'm going to save some time for
Okay, great.
about 15 minutes for questions afterwards.
Great.
So, any burning questions?
Go to a hearing, experience. I mean, I think that law school is amazing, but it's a bubble, and the opportunities that you have to engage with some of the practice happening are great. So go to a hearing, go listen to an oral argument about something. You know, there's like from the nonprofit side, we do tons of action alerts, sign our action alerts, come to our lobbying days. You know, you can go talk to your elected officials about some of these issues. I think those are all easy ways to get involved while you're in law school. I don't know, post-law school, it sort of depends on where you end up. I mean, you were in private practice. I've been in private practice before. I think there's nothing, I mean, you can do good within private practice. Like, I think there are ways that you can represent and advise your clients, if they're corporations, to comply with the laws. And you know, it's going to be better in the long run if you actually put in these environmentally protective things. And I think there are ways, even from, you know, the dark side, that you can influence things and make them better for everyone. And then I don't know if you guys have all experienced this, but I think collegiality and professionalism is just like hugely important. You know, like I approach my briefs and I approach my opposing counsel as professional sort of colleagues, and you know, I take their arguments as they come, and I refute them with case law and facts and the issues as I have them. And I think that sort of making sure that you don't stoop to the level of mudslinging, and you know, it's particularly in the litigation context, you have a sort of prescribed sphere in which you're working, and keeping it professional and appropriate, I think, is helpful to accomplishing good resolutions and in convincing them that your issues are legitimate and important. So,
yeah, everything Alice said is right. There are a lot of ways to get involved, and particularly I want to pick up on the collegiality point. I've dealt with a lot of people over the years. There have been some really nasty personalities on the other side, and also people who are perfectly willing to lie to the judge or perjure themselves. Like you, I don't know if you would believe, but it's crazy. Just recently, like we've gotten, like within the last month, we've had somebody sign an affidavit, send it to the judge, and it's demonstrably perjurious. And that happens. And really, like, if you end up working for industry, like, draw a line, you know? Say, like, I'm not gonna perjure myself. I'm not gonna bring frivolous things. People don't draw that line. People do what they want to please their client. And it's unethical, illegal, and it just brings it makes the whole profession of law look as it is, but worse than it has to be. You know? It doesn't have to be like that. And like Alice, like, I pride myself in, you know, bringing arguments that are permissible to bring, in being professional to people, even people who I think are assholes. Be professional to them, you know, like, treat them with respect, say hi to them. Like, people won't say hi sometimes. People will gaslight you in emails and other communications, and it can be crazy. But
I will say that I actually have had a number of like really amazing opposing counsels.
That's true,
that
too.
Like I consider friends at this point, and people who I've had as opposing counsel and then have been pro bono with me on another case as co-counsel. So there is a way to do it effectively and well, and it's unfortunate when you come across it in such an aggressive and negative way. So.
Yeah, absolutely true. But yeah, how to get involved? I mean, at Clean Air Council, one way to get involved is join a local group where you live that is like fighting some of these things that you want to fight. That's the basic building block of change, is at the grassroots, and everything else is built up from that. We have action alerts too. Do them. They actually matter. Calling your legislature matters more than you might think. It really does. Raising environmental issues, a lot of times they don't hear those issues from people. They need to hear that people care about having clean water to drink. You might not realize that EPA a few years ago told DEP that it was failing in its legal obligations to provide clean water, or to oversee clean water that is provided by public water sources. Like, you know, I don't know about Philadelphia in particular, but like, that was something that I didn't realize, and your government is not protecting you as much as it says it is. It's not doing its job, and we need to join things, lobby, call people, and be the heroes that you want to see in the world.
So I'm not an attorney, so I probably get to run my mouth a little bit more, but I think it's just fine to talk shit about people that are defending interests that are clearly having harmful effects on communities, and that are indefensible and illegitimate and overall bad. But I get to say that when I talk to communities and I'm not in the courtroom, probably for that reason. But I think it's fine to be mean to people that are hurting people. So that said, as far as our work goes, I mean, we do have a number of legal research projects. I mean, Karen has been involved with folks in other schools as well, that people could potentially get involved if they have time. And we also actually have a group at Temple Law that's putting on a screening of a documentary related to some of our work. So those types of things, you know, that don't take too much time. In addition, I agree that getting involved either in your community here or maybe where you're from is extremely important, because a lot of the attorneys that we work with and hire have been advocates and activists at some point. I think that's really important when it comes to being able to relate with and empathize with the communities or with the clients that you may end up working with, so that you can really understand where they're coming from. And I think, you know, our perspective with communities is we're not riding in there on the white horse to do something for you. We are going in there to work with you to help you get what you want, and we'll stand with you and fight with you, not be the lead for you. So it's a different relationship that we try to do with folks, which is more collaborative, rather than having them look to us as the lawyers or as the organization that will be the experts to do the work for them. We want to be involved with them and stand with them. So I think it's really important to get involved where you're at, to have that experience as well and know what it's like to be on the other side.
Yeah, like Chad mentioned, we are definitely open to having legal research assistance. If, you know, I don't know how Penn structures it with, if it's like a practicum or whatever, but we're also probably restarting our internship program. So, you know, feel free to reach out through organizers, but yeah, I would also say, you know, beyond just the environmental, I know this is the environmental law panel, but yeah, sort of echoing what everyone else has said, just as far as like the issues that you feel are important in your community or in communities that matter to you. Trying to be a movement lawyer as much as possible. I think like following the lead of the community themselves and, you know, organizers is incredibly important, and lawyers are really full of ourselves and like think that we know everything, or we can find it on Westlaw, and like that's not true. I mean, you're there to use your expertise and knowledge to serve, in my opinion, to serve the community.
And I'll add on also, thank you for bringing it up. We also, and probably PennFuture does as well, like we take interns during the semester. And Environmental Law Project, join them, and you know, and if you, at least from my perspective, from the litigation perspective, if you're volunteering and if you can commit to sort of a certain amount of time every week for like an ongoing thing, that's much more helpful for lawsuits than necessarily jumping right in, because there's a learning curve, and once you get beyond the learning curve, then you can really contribute a lot. So we're always taking interns. Talk to me if you're interested. That would be delightful. So.
Ditto.
And on that note, I'd like to go ahead and open it for questions. Yep.
You touched on this a little bit, but I know in some other states there's a lot of things that can be environmental law and local minorities, and so that seems like a different civil or federal right that you can approach environmental awareness and how to.
So I'll just jump in, but other people jump in too. DEP has like an environmental justice program. I don't know if program is the right term, but I don't know that they do much, but it exists. I think a lot of times, so anecdote, a couple years ago at the Environmental Law Forum, which you should all attend if you can get funding to go, it's great. It's also very educational.
Yes.
It's a lot of corporate attorneys. You get to hang out with all the corporate environmental law attorneys.
Hear the inside scoop from their
Really
perspective.
interesting.
Revolving door.
Revolving door, that's right. But somebody, an attorney for Rex Energy, I think it was Rex, maybe Range Resources, for Range Resources, which is a big fracking company, said that they, when deciding where to site things, they look for, they don't site them where the big houses are, the nice plots of land. So acknowledging that, people with resources have the resources to push back. So that happens, we see that all the time. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of legal hooks for that, at least from my perspective and my practice. So it's work that needs to be done. I don't know how to approach it, and in Pennsylvania, I haven't seen a lot of people successfully approach it, at least from the legal standpoint. I think that's a big political issue.
I guess I would just say that from our perspective, it's true, especially in the environmental issues, that they are often forced on communities that don't have resources, that are often for rural, but then again with urban issues as well, labor issues and often pipelines and other things are forced through low-income communities in urban areas. Our perspective is not to fight on, a lot of the arguments we make is that it doesn't matter whether you have resources, it doesn't matter whether you live in an urban or rural area, that the people that are most affected by decisions should be the ones that get to make those decisions, regardless of income level and things like that. So that's how we deal with that, is that it's less about resources and income, although we do use that in PR and education, but that it really shouldn't matter what your resource level is. And so we deal with it more from a self-government perspective than we do from an income perspective.
I think it's something that, I think there's frequently those communities are impacted by numerous things over and over again, and that's sort of, it's the piling on of one thing after another which really creates the damage. And I think what the environmental justice program at DEP is supposed to do is they have sort of these suite of permits that if you're in what they consider an environmental justice community, they get an extra review or some additional sort of outreach to the public. And I think what they're trying to do there is address some of those cumulative impacts. And I don't know that they effectively do it or that they do it at all, but I think that that's sort of their attempt. I always think of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, as sort of a way to grapple with cumulative impacts, and it's something that Pennsylvania doesn't have a mini NEPA, so in a lot of ways DEP skirts the cumulative impacts issue by just saying this project here is fine because it ticked off the boxes. It doesn't matter that there are 10 other projects within a mile of that, and I think that's really concerning, and it sort of adds, it's like death by a million cuts, right? Like that water body is fine, and we're only going to allow projects that are under an acre there, but we're going to allow 100 projects that are under an acre there, and you're just like, well, that didn't work, did it? And so, I think that's one of the ways that it's a little bit of a backdoor into dealing with the environmental justice issue, but I think sometimes it's around cumulative impacts and finding a way to address those or grapple with those can help some of those communities. So.
I would just add too that talking about cumulative impacts in communities that have been basically screwed over and over in different ways because they don't have a lot of resources. One thing that we found is in working with communities with like not a lot of resources and relatively rich ones, or privileged ones I should say, is that the learning curve for the privileged communities is much steeper because they believe that the system is working for them. And you really, I mean, Chad can speak more to this, but you really have a lot of education to do to get them to see that, and a lot of times they don't see it until it happens to them firsthand, that like, no, they're, you know, you can't win this one. There's just no way. Whereas like communities that have been disadvantaged are like, they know, they already know. Yeah. And so they're ready to, you know, they're, you know, they're used to fighting for their rights. So it's something we've seen.
I'm not a student. In 1978, I wrote the operational procedures for the fourth affirmative action. Stuff like race war companies going for. How our enforce 1,000 integrated peacefully. And I'm a Cherokee and I represent the Doctrines in the public. And what you've actually been talking about is these foreign entities coming to our country, stealing our resources, and subverting the ecosystem to the point where people are dying. Have you thought about looking at this as genocide, like ecocide, as a legal point of view? Because that's really what's happening.
We haven't run that argument. I mean, we use that terminology sometimes with the communities that we work with. I think maybe that comes into the rights of nature work a bit more, which we haven't talked on a lot today, but the rights of nature stuff that Karen mentioned is about actually transforming the current way that we view environmental law and environmental protection. Right now it's seen as property under the law, whereas rights of nature would actually, it does transform the ecosystem, the environment, into being a rights-bearing entity that humans are actually a part of at that point. And so I just had the first Native American tribe in the United States last week. Their council voted to transform their tribal constitution into giving all of the property and ecosystems where they live rights-bearing status. So they have used some of that language as well. We haven't made those arguments in court though, but it's a part of how we talk about what's happening to the environment. But as far as the legal arguments, we have not made those.
The issue of this peace war, internationally, it's not an actual item in international law right now. The tribal government put in a petition to make it an actual item in international law. So we can get these criminals out of here. And if you actually do the research, you will discover shockingly that all these corporate entities have a foreign base. And so that's why they're so adamant about doing what they're doing. Basically, constantly stealing the natural resources of our community and killing people in the process.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's right. And yeah, I think building on what Chad said, a lot of it is who we're talking to. You know, if we're talking with communities about what's happening in their community, like they'll understand that if we talk with, if we're talking to a judge or something like that, you know, like the judge is coming from a very different place. So so it depends on, you know, who we're talking to. But I think that what you're saying is essentially right. And, you know, from my perspective, a lot of what this is extraction. It's taking something and saying, I can consider this mine, and it doesn't matter what the consequences are of the taking it.
The whole thing with this that I discovered by really looking at the main point of this, that they're creating bogus legal protocols that are not lawful to steal stuff and kill people. Until Castile activated the environmental laws, it was essentially ignored because they're really on the payroll of these corporations.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay.
I can't distinguish, I mean,
Right.
because, yeah,
There's
there's
so
so many, and I think to focus only on one excludes so many other things. And so, I mean, the way that we bring it all together, which is to look at the intersectionality of all these issues. And so, for example, the constitutional amendment that we're running with communities we've worked with is called Right of Local Self-Government, which would be about amending the state constitution to decentralize decision-making authority back to the community level for them to enact laws that protect their health and safety and that go above the state standards and the federal standards. I mean, and not just on environmental issues, but on social justice issues as well. So they could pass electoral laws, for example, that get money out of politics at the city level or something like that. Or they could increase the minimum wage. Right now they're told they can't because the state sets a ceiling on that communities can't go beyond. And so that's what ties it all together for us. It's not just environmental. And so if it is a single thing, again, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is we don't think the people most affected by decisions are being able to make them. And so we need to transform the Constitution, which is right now being weaponized and used as a blunt object to beat the shit out of our communities by corporate interests, is actually decentralize that power back to the people and give them the power they need to make the decisions on important issues facing them. Because they're often the experts in the communities. It's not us or anybody else. They know what they need.
I don't disagree with any of that, but I will also say that I think that the force, the greatest force for destroying and removing protections for the environment in Pennsylvania right now, to me, appears to be the gas industry.